santi del quotidiano, uomini e donne che hanno preso sul serio l'invito di Gesù e si sono messi alla sua sequela, senza gesti spettacolari, senza effetti speciali. Perché la casa di Dio, diceva Georges Bernanos,
Everyday saints, men and women who took Jesus' invitation seriously and followed him, without spectacular gestures, without special results, because the house of God, George Bernanos said, is a house for men and not for superhuman. Christians are not supermen, and neither are the saints, or even more, since they are the most human of humans. Men and women who do not distinguish themselves from others by their condition of life, their social role or work, but who in their everyday life to testify to Jesus, immersed in history and in solidarity with little ones and with the poor, without photogenic halos, with glamour, yet bright. Because as Pope Francis says, holiness is the true light of the Church and its most beautiful face. The next door saints, Giorgio, Luis, Carlo, Antonietta, Maria, Teresio, Vittorio, Pier Giorgio, Ramon, Oscar, Giuseppe. Faces who in Catholic action have found their way to holiness. Men on the front, and who dialogue, ready to grasp the signs of the Spirit outside the conventional and institutional enclosures. This is the most beautiful adventure, to which we are all called, the good fight, the race which does not produce medals, but, on the contrary, brings about misunderstandings, mistrust, suffering. A countercurrent choice, in keeping with the gospel beatitudes, but which brings true joy with it. Not with humor, because bad temper, Pope Francis recalls, is not a sign of holiness. A joy which does not result from the cleaning of one's eyes in an alleged ecstasy, but comes with Parisian, that evangelical frankness of audacity, an intelligent, thought-out and internalized faith, which does not like sentimentalism and superficiality. It is a communal journey that requires constancy in prayer, vigilance and discernment, not a hobby, a temporary occupation, an option. Moralists, Bernanos said, willingly consider holiness as a luxury, but it is a necessity.
Venezuelából érkezett hozzánk.
Our guest today has come from Venezuela. Baltazar Porras, Cardinal Baltazar Porras, who's the Cardinal of Mérida. He's the chair of the foundation of Pope Pius XI. His country, Venezuela, is often in the news, even in Hungary, due to the prevailing crisis and street conflicts that are going on. The role of faith has become increasingly important in the country because people have to face the challenges. What does faith mean in a country where food shortages, repressed protests are a constant phenomenon? In such situations, faith becomes a firm stance in favor of truth, peace, and justice. Cardinal Porras is here not only as a Cardinal of Venezuela, but also as a key figure of the Latin American Catholic action, because he plays a key role in this organization, and the Catholic action will also be an important topic in today's presentation.
Archbishop of Mérida, President of the Foundation Catholic Action School of Sanctity Pio XI. The South American country, where even in peacetime warlike conditions prevail, is plagued by several economic problems. The welfare system of the country is essentially in ruins. Baltazar Porras appears not only as a Cardinal of Venezuela, but also as a defining figure of the Latin American Actio Catholica. The thought word of the Actio Catholica also plays a decisive role in focus of his presentation today. Please welcome Baltazar Porras.
Good
afternoon in Hungarian.
Good afternoon, buon pomeriggio, buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Un saludo muy especial y particular, pues sentirme presente aquí en medio de todos ustedes.
It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you. I represent Latin America among you. At this Congress, at this Eucharistic Congress, I'm really grateful for the invitation of Cardinal Baltazar. And I would also like to greet all the organizers of this Congress, because this Congress is absolutely wonderful. Today, my topic is the saints of the people of God in the world and the lay vocation to holiness. In his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul describes the life of a Christian as a spiritual war, and he encourages the faithful to grow strong in the Lord with the strength of his power. The weapons of the believers are not the ones used in a war, but those given to us by God, so as to be able to resist the devil's tactics. To believe means to be able to face the vicissitudes of life in the name of God. To believe means to defend the truth, justice, peace, and to fight firmly and courageously against everything that blocks this path. It means to proclaim aloud the respect due to all human life, the irreplaceable role of family, the sanctity of the conjugal covenant, the hospitality with which migrants should be received, the right of the elderly to receive assistance, and the obligation to help all vulnerable people. In one word, it means the freedom to bear witness to the faith and not to be condemned to silence. In the modern world, including the world of those of us who consider ourselves believers and practicing Christians, talking about holiness sounds strange and out of place. The idea of the uselessness of religion has become part of our culture, pushing Nietzsche's idea that is, God is dead and we killed him. I think that we must search for the cause of this deformation, first of all, by asking ourselves whether this cause is an external factor coming from outside the Church, or it has been mostly brought about by a deficient ecclesiology, which put more emphasis on the hierarchical aspect of the Church than on its baptismal dimension, more emphasis on hierarchy than on communion, thus leading to the conclusion that anyone wanting to be a better Christian must enter a convent or become a priest. The representatives of this approach tended to see ordinary Christians as a weakness, as members of the Church who could only collaborate with or contribute to the pastoral action of the Church through their obedience to the hierarchy. So after this introduction, we should discuss the question what holiness is. We obviously need to ask ourselves about what holiness consists in. However, the temptation is always there to act like Pilate, that is, to turn our back on an issue that is in some way foreign to and distant from the everyday life of the majority of the people of God. The idea that holiness is something reserved only for a few people, something that has nothing to do with the world we live in, is still widespread. Therefore, following the instructions of Pope Francis, we should bring into focus what has been, until now, the periphery, since the agent of evangelization is more than an organic and hierarchical institution. She is first and foremost a people advancing on its pilgrim way towards God. If we take a look at the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, we can see that in Lumen Gentium and in Nostra Aetate, the Council discusses that the Church is a sacrament of salvation. The Church is, in Christ, like a sacrament or as a sign and instrument, both of a very closely knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. I would also like to quote shortly another document of the Second Vatican Council, which is Nostra Aetate. All Christ's faithful Okay, the Nostra Aetate says that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, these precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of the truth which enlightens all men. This Congress has to deal with the topic of lay faithful and their role in the Church. All the popes of recent decades, St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, all find it important to talk about the saints of everyday life. Pope Pius XI also gave it an important role. And that is why he described the Catholic action as the school of sanctity. All the movements that emerged after the Second Vatican Council covered this topic in one way or another. Pope Benedict XVI entrusted an important role to the Catholic action in dealing with young people.
De la Iglesia, de los laicos. Y más recientemente, pues el Papa Francisco nos indica la más alta medida de la santidad.
The lay faithful will need vocation to live holiness. We've heard lots of testimonies. We have encountered lots of witnesses and testimonies who live and witness that God has endless love for all of us. And in the context and in time that we actually live in, we're going to see examples of that, and the introductory film was about that.
Haciendo de la acogida y el diálogo el estilo con el cual se hagan próximos los unos a los otros, experimentando la belleza de una responsabilidad compartida.
Well, we have lost interpretation from Spanish, I'm afraid, in the meanwhile.
Now I'm going to talk about the situation in Latin America, which might be less known to you, maybe here in Europe and in other parts of the world. And because this might show a more cheerful face of the Church. This all began with the faithfulness that the Church in Latin America after the Second Vatican Council, with different meetings in the post-conciliar period, showed. The Latin American episcopate worked for justice. They looked for a synthesis of the modern and the old, the temporal and the eternal, and using their originality typical of Latin America. Afterwards, sorry, we were having troubles with the interpretation, with the technique.
11 años más tarde, en 1979,
In time, things have clarified. In 1991 in Los Angeles,
en el que el pueblo de Los Ángeles, en México, pues es uno de los
in Puebla de Los Angeles, Mexico, the third
Iglesia América Latina que ha marcado su camino. El papel
General Conference took place under the guidance of Pope John Paul II, elected 2024. According to preface, the light offered by the Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi,
y los constructores de la sociedad pluralista.
possibly the key document of the post-council thought of Paul VI. And later, in 1992, on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the arrival of Europeans in America, which is controversial, the fourth General Conference was held in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, with the aim of having Christ in the midst of the life of our peoples, we call on the faithful to take part in a new evangelization, and particularly we call the lay faithful, among them the young people. We commit ourselves to working with the integral promotion of the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, with the firm intention of making sure that the main beneficiaries of such actions are the poorest. The fifth General Conference took place in 2007 during the pontificate of Benedict the 16th in Aparecida, Brazil. The then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio played an important role as coordinator of the final document, which a couple of years later served as inspiration for the flagship document written already as Pope Francis, i.e. the Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. Quote, "While we suffer and rejoice, we remain in the love of Christ, viewing our world. We try to discern its paths with the joyful hope of undescribable gratitude of believing in Jesus Christ." The General Conference of Aparecida emphasized the fact that the baptized were the disciples and missionaries. We praise God for the men and women in Latin America and the Caribbean who, impelled by their faith, have worked untiringly in defense of the human person, especially the poor and outcast. In their testimony, taken to the point of total commitment, the dignity of the human being shines forth. And it seems that, and it is possible to do both. Now, if we think of the Amazon basin, they want to make sure that there's continuity in the teachings of the Lord and the Church. We must ask the question, what holiness is at the turn of the two eras. Although we talk about a change from one era to the other, conceptual and practical tools that we use are mostly not fit for handling such a change. Significant change are going on in the depth of societies in terms of culture, politics, economy, and of course religion. It should be highlighted that religion is a historical product, a social construct. This means that without prejudice to its universality, in each area and period it bears the mark of the given society. This guarantees its continuity as an institution, its role as a point of reference before public authorities, as well as its social integration. Christians fulfill themselves in the environment in which they happen to live. The faith is lived out in the specific reality of life of the people, and from there, stems the spirituality that gives meanings to man's existence. It is true that secularization has come to dominate the modern world. We tend to see what is negative, which is certainly real. However, we must be aware of what is positive, to which is a lot, also because it is the today of God. When the umbilical cord ensuring the link with the cord of Christianity, maintained partly by the direct reference made to Christian values, is cut, authentic freedom becomes possible, which allows faith to become a personal choice instead of a mere culturalization. Funnily enough, in the secularized world, we can observe an increase in religiosity. In the postmodern world, religion continues to be a point of reference because it provides answers to permanent concerns, which are also present in urban and global societies. Religion is often appreciated because of the way it answers to the needs of everyday life. That is where we find the challenge of making the most of the situation in order to become ever more genuine followers of Jesus. Here we have a task that is not fulfilled only in our own individual subjective life, but also in the community's experience, in a common experience where the plurality of answers leads to serious personal discernment, where we do not form separate islands, but an archipelago, which in appropriate answers given to the real needs inherent in everyday life. We must ask ourselves, is there holiness in the 21st century? When more than 50 years ago, Karl Rahner said to the Christians of the 21st century will either be mystic or cease to be Christians. He, as a visionary and a prophet, identified what would make Christianity meaningful and powerful in this new global scenario. Being a witness, a disciple, a missionary implies the need of dedicating considerable attention, time and effort to prayer. It's not an exaggeration to say, as Elie Wiesel said, deprive our people of prayer and you'll have condemned their soul to silence. I believe that when all forms of prayer have been eradicated from a society, then sowing of the seeds of dehumanization has possibly begun. And we understand that, we live that. Prayer as a path to holiness is not detached from acting for the good of our neighbors. The thermometer for measuring man's love for God is found in the parables of the Last Judgment. When did we see you? When you did each one of the last of these. In order to be holy, we need to reach a limit. We need to get to a point of annihilation where there's only one thing we can do: hope in the Lord. Is holiness reserved for those who are virtuous and perfect? Can the poor, those suffering from all kinds of injuries, the sinners with their wounds and even though their false hope to attain holiness? If Jesus' words, the poor have good news preached to them, are true, then holiness must be offered and made accessible to the most wounded and those most in need. An original and inspiring example, particularly attractive to young people, is the young blessed Carlo Acutis. He's very well known in my country and was beautified recently. In his short life and each of the work on earth, he worked for the spreading of faith through the digital world, which exercises a great attractive power on people and stimulates the creativity enabled by the possibilities of such technology. In all his photos, in all his photos, we always see him smile. True holiness is a joy because a sad saint is a sorry saint, Pope Francis wrote to the Bishop of of Avila Jesus Garcia Borillo in his letter about the 5th anniversary of the centuries of Jesus. Joy and smile must always be present in the life of Christians, even the most difficult ones. In this life, we all tread the path of the dark night. Abraham had faith, yet he didn't understand how God's promises could be fulfilled, because having descendants and receiving God's blessing seemed impossible at his age. With no children of his own, Job became a laughingstock to his friends. Confronted with his enemy, despite being faithful, his bitterness and anxiety became prayer against our hope. This is the everyday experience of those of us who live in a hostile world, where being believers is becoming dangerous. It is said with good news that in the 20th century and in that part of the third millennium that we have known, there have been more martyrs than in the first centuries of the Church. Only prayer gives the strength needed to overcome the trials and tribulations. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The mind is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. The flesh is weak. We feel the limitations of all flesh. We feel our misery. Our wounded flesh is the door through which God can enter and manifest himself. We must simply acknowledge our wounded nature as it is and leave space through prayer for the strength to manifest itself. However, the only journey from which man does not come back with empty hands is his interior journey. It is inside where we choose between what is correct and what is easy, where we become more mature, where we learn to distinguish between good and evil, where we are capable of perceiving and considering the manifestations of love, solidarity, and mercy. One of the young persons who has been a model for the youth since the first World Youth Day is Blessed Père Giorgio Frassati, the man of the 8 Beatitudes, a young man who always pursued the most ambitious and noble goals of life. Talking to young people in Turin, Pope Francis wanted to repeat the words of Pier Giorgio, words that convey a strong message. You have to want to do good in life. Live. Do not vegetate. Live.
And this leads us to the next question. Are there any saints today? In preparation for the Jubilee of the year 2000, St. John Paul II invited us to discover and propose models of Christian life of our contemporary world. There is a great deal of good and virtue around us that we don't want to see. In the middle of the current pandemic, Pope Francis also invites us to discover the saints who walk the streets next to us, those who do not match our traditional ideas, or perhaps do not even consider themselves believers. However, they give everything for the life of others. Let us take a look at ourselves in the mirror of so many health workers, doctors, nurses, hospital porters, and support staff members who risk their own lives in order to save other people's lives. Pope Francis recently approved the beatification of a doctor, a layperson, researcher, and university professor who was a pioneer of the modernization of medicine in his country, Venezuela, my country. His name is José Gregorio Hernández, and he is becoming a model and witness in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. 100 years ago, during the so-called Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919, when this pandemic hit many countries around the world, he and other doctors were working for the health of the people, despite the lack of means needed for providing proper health care. Service based on the example of the Good Samaritan is manifest in those men and women in whom faith and science are united, who work with the power of faith to serve their neighbors, particularly the marginalized, the sick, and those rejected by society. But we have other similar role models as well, such as Saint Giuseppe Moscati, the physician of Naples. You can see the photos on the screen. He's also well known in Hungary. There must be examples in Hungary as well, but on the screen you can see a couple of examples: Saint Giuseppe Moscati, Saint Gianna Beretta Molla. And we can turn to these saints for their intercession when we are having health problems, which is a very typical problem nowadays. They were all men of God and women of God who can help us from heaven. But it's also important that we not forget about the large number of missionaries, priests, and the lay faithful who assist the poorest people in the most remote countries of the world with dedication, tenderness, and competence. They represent sensitivity in a world that is indifferent. They work for promoting the quality of life of their neighbors. They work for the refugees. They are witnesses to holiness today. They put into practice the works of mercy in a world that is indifferent to and turns its back on the thousands of people who suffer. They are the witnesses to holiness today, role models that help us achieve the reintegration of the people excluded from society when the pandemic is over. I'm also the chair of the Pius XI School of Sanctity of the Catholic Action Foundation, which has its seat in the Vatican. The organization has the objective of making known all those persons, witnesses, who lose their vocation as lay faithful, religious, priests, or pastors, to the full thanks fully to the Catholic Action. They are witnesses of holiness recognized by the Church or saints next door. All of them are our fellows, treading the same path of everyday life towards holiness as we do. I think mainly of the situation in Latin America, but I suppose that Africa and Asia can be similar. There are many villages and hamlets where people keep the Catholic faith alive and bear witness to it without the constant presence of priests and religious. They do so thanks to oral tradition and by living the most genuine Christian vocation. In many cases, these people have no deep knowledge of the content of their faith, but they are moved by the force of their conviction and faith. This is how the faith had been preserved through centuries in the Far East, in remote places of the Amazon basin, and in the plains of Venezuela in the 19th century. The vast majority of catechists all around the world have been men and women who had no academic formation but had the sensus fidei, the sense of faith, which they transmitted with joy and hope, with a deep love for Jesus, Our Lady, the saints, the Pope, and the Church. That is the source of the eternal value of popular tradition. And now we're going to talk a bit about Pope Francis and the question of holiness, because this topic is very close to the Pope's heart. The call to holiness has and needs new languages and new faces. The mystics are the best role models of the past. In periods marked by difficult circumstances, they were signs of joy in the midst of contradictions, an example of constancy and fortitude in the face of adversities. That is how they transmitted to us, through their testimony and their writings, the importance of tradition. Today, Pope Francis reminds us that the mission of Christians is not to do proselytism, but to share the fire that fills the souls with warmth. The mission of the Church has a fundamental objective, that everyone we meet can feel infinitely loved by God beyond their limitations, and that they can also regain their dignity and the call to fraternal communion. These were words of Pope Francis. The Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Gaudium by Pope Francis describes the path of holiness proper to all the baptized people. The entire people of God has the task of spreading the gospel. It is essential to emphasize this, since we must become aware of the fact that the radicalism of the call does not mean that we participate in an activity entrusted to us by others. This is not about the hierarchy, but about the conviction that the salvation which God offers us is the work of His mercy. We are all missionary disciples. We must regain the evangelizing power of popular piety. We all build on what we received from our parents. We often think that we grow in Christian life when we adhere to certain schools of spirituality that replace the simple piety that we learned at home or that we find in the beautiful traditions of the different peoples. The incarnation also of the faith happens through the assumption of what is weak and apparently banal. Each people is the creator of their own culture and the protagonist of their own history. Being human means being at the same time son and father of the culture to which one belongs. Each portion of the people of God, by translating the gift of God into its own life, and in accordance with its own genius, bears witness to the faith it has received and enriches it with new and eloquent expressions. One can say that a people continuously evangelizes itself. Our culture always plays an important role in how we see, in how we translate to ourselves God's gifts and the faith. So as we have just said, we can say that the people continuously evangelizes itself. Another idea that we can mention is that evangelization is a task carried out from person to person. The pandemic has opened up huge digital opportunities. They are good and necessary, yet they do not replace but only complete and help the missionary work, which includes being covered with the dust of the road and facing with compassion the reality, which is often painful due to poverty. And this requires us not to observe the needs from a podium, but to face them from the field of everyday life. In his apostolic exhortation, Gaudete et Exsultate, Pope Francis addresses us much more explicitly and issues a more urgent, timely, and challenging invitation to take seriously the universal call to holiness. This is what we will see today as well. The Pope asks us to integrate this call into the context of today's word. He opens the horizon to the saints next door. Nor need we think only of those already beatified or canonized. The Holy Spirit bestows holiness in abundance among God's holy and faithful people, for it has pleased God to make men and women holy and to save them, not as individuals without any bond between them, but rather as a people who might acknowledge Him in truth and serve Him in holiness. In salvation history, the Lord saved one people. We are never completely ourselves unless we belong to a people. This is a gentle prompting, so that we all assume the task of being light and salt, saints proclaiming the sure hope of transcendence and solidarity, and that we do so not merely as individuals, but as members of a specific community. It is small gestures that multiply the sanctifying activity. And this requires watching out for temptations and deviations, due to which we must constantly strive to judge things as the Master would judge them. I think that we must pay attention to some characteristics which are simple but challenging, very human, and therefore they are very similar to Jesus' features. We need endurance, perseverance, patience, meekness, joy and sense of humor, courage and zeal, community, and constant prayer. This holiness is accessible to all, without distinction, and this holiness consists in each person focusing transparently and constantly on being sowers of good, imbued with the spirit of reconciliation and the attitude of the Good Samaritan. This can be attained by a constant struggle, watchfulness, and discernment.
Y que se ha transmitido así de generación en generación, y es el ejemplo que nos anima a todos a seguir adelante.
There's an example here that a laywoman received a meal.
En Fratelli Tutti, asumir la caridad desde las categorías de fraternidad.
And we must persevere, as the Pope had invited us. Brotherhood, fraternity, and love is what we need to live. This is what today's world needs. We need to live in a world which embraces and incorporates the good sample of the Good Samaritan. We really rethink the politics, the relations. We need to bring about a space in the midst of now talking about the good samples. Pope Francis had added the traditional macro dimension in the space of politics. He added to the traditional testimony of St. Thomas More to the testimony of Robert Schuman, the French father of the European community. And this offers a reason and occasion for reconsidering politics and promote vocational services in the field of politics in new communities that are sensitive to its capacity to humanize the world and to a new culture of dialogue and social friendship, which creates a way of reunion based on truth, freedom, justice, solidarity, and forgiveness, which are elements of authentic and lasting peace. This is a task that the religions of the world must contribute. We must add to this public dimension of those who build a society, entrepreneurs, workers, the immense world of work and workers. This field also offers us role models, men and women, such as the Italian entrepreneur Marcello Candia or the Argentinian entrepreneur Enrique. Both of them are in the process of beatification, because in a true spirit of dialogue we grow in our ability to grasp the significance of what others say and go, even if we cannot accept it as our own conviction. In this way, it becomes possible to be frank and open about our beliefs while continuing to discuss, to seek points of contact, and above all, to work and struggle together. All that has been said, however, can become a theory that has no influence on people's lives and does not produce need of radical change in us. Resistant to change and anthropological reality, convergence is indispensable. In order to enter a sacred space, we have to take all of our shoes, leaving everything, like Moses when he met Yahweh. According to Pope Francis, the Church must follow the path of synodality, which means that we have to work shoulder to shoulder in communion and with active participation. The Church is a communion rooted in the mystery of the communion of the Blessed Trinity. God the Father, His Son, and Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Our God is not a sad solitude, but a blessed communion. This is a true root and explanation of the Church's self-understanding as communion. The synodal style expressed by the mission of the Church is today's word, and it ensures novelty required by the Holy Spirit in our times. It manifests how the ecclesiology of the people of God and the communion described by the Second Vatican Council are put into practice. Synodality makes the dynamic of grace operational. It starts from the equal dignity of all the baptized peoples. They receive diverse charism and ministries through which grace promotes the building of an ecclesial community of the service of the missionary activity. Synodality enables the lay faithful to discover their responsibility for building the church and a more humane world. It is not aimed at replacing priestly ministry with a view of solving the problem of the decreasing number of vocations to priesthood experienced all over the world. We are facing a clearly ecclesiological problem, but we must approach it from the perspective of fundamental theology that views the task of evangelization as an activity serving the universal salvation in a pluralistic world. This requires the communion and the responsibility of all baptized faithful. A change of paradigm is needed since we live in a society in which the social relevance of the church has become blurred. This comes from the Church's call to convention and the necessity of responding to the urgent needs of today's world. The believer is not the person who is the first to obey certain commandments or to confess certain truth. A believer is a person who listens to God's voice resounding in their souls, who gradually recognizes it and becomes aware of this personal search going on in their soul, and eventually becomes able to give the reason for God's presence and the hope thus discovered. The true path to holiness is the one that leads us to a personal relation with God, to which we open up, in which we must take root and then grow in order to become strong and resistant to the threats throughout our life. The holiness of the lay faithful of all the baptized includes the exercise of humanity and acceptance of the reality of that imposes limits in our lives. It includes the discovery of our own insecurity, which helps us not to consider ourselves almighty and the invulnerable, and to look for our strength outside of ourselves in heaven. The solitude brought about by the pandemic leads us to resist isolation, and we also experience interdependence, the need to work for the common good, the richness of the diversity of function, the need to look after others, the existence of people in reality, precarious situations needing for help. Facing the finitude and fragility of life makes us perceive the value of others, the value of the community. In order to start appreciating and being grateful to what we used to take for granted, we must discover the love of each day and love each other a bit more or better, because we have experienced that what is truly eternal, the true hope is in God. By way of conclusion, why should we endeavor to be sent in today's world? Does it make sense, or is it some useless exercise? Christian spirituality is very rich, yet instead of science, it is a rather interior experience, mysticism of eyes wide open to the world and to the world surrounding us. We must overcome the dualism between the history of faith and our own personal history, between the word of faith and to the world of reason, between the profession of faith and the professional experience. I invite you to seek the path of holiness, following the path and the personal testimony of Pope Francis. His use of the word is always perplexing. This is source of the novelty of his thoughts, the fact that baffles us. An encyclical beginning with non-Catholic figures and the fact that he was inspired by his conversations with leaders of other religions are not to everybody's liking. There are also people who criticize him for making negative references to certain fashion of anti-values that make the people implied become upset because the facts described are more eloquent than any doctrinal statement. I believe that an encyclical classified as social is at least what we believe is a meditation combines the simple Bible way of viewing life with inputs from the gospel, highlights the crevices of modern society. Human rights are being proclaimed as a great achievement of the modern era, yet the encyclical clearly reveals that they have not been put into practice, while it also mentions numerous advantages of the institutions of the globalized world. The mission is to act. The pedagogy of faith and the spirituality growth of the baptized have a beautiful path in harmony with what we have already seen. What I find fascinating in Fratelli Tutti beyond the social aspect is the constant presence of authors' Christian conviction combined with such an open attitude that I think is not unfamiliar to the pluralistic global way of thinking, the correct characteristics of today's diverse world. It is not easy reading, since everyday life itself is not a comfortable journey either, because it's full questions of points to consider, so that the future of each person and the entire world be clear, which is needed due to the present uncertainty shown to the COVID pandemic. The path is full of mistakes, which is inspire us more to be creative and joyful than inactive or desperate. Christian conviction is a fertile soil for sowing fraternity, friendship, and holiness with generosity in this world, who's an eager for love for of God for our neighbors. Well, we build the city of God in this world, which is home to the nasty realities and the presence of evil. But it's first of all, it is home to freedom and sincere love for the entire creation. And the sure hope of love will have the last and final word. I wrote your prayer of the 20th century Venezuelan poet Andres Pronovo. He wrote from an opposite shore, inspired by the proximity of priest when he was unjustly imprisoned. The title of dedicating the morning to Jesus Galilee, holiness transcends even the borders of religion. I hope that my reflection will be fitting prologue to our meditation of the holiness of the Jesus, my commander, supreme formula of holiness, most perfect flower of man's supreme age. When the sun is rising, I offer you the first glance of my eyes with the seed of my first thoughts. For desire for justice that today robs of my tremendous sin of laziness, I give you thanks. For the desire for fraternity, which alleviates the panorama of my dark lusts, I give you thanks. For the blessed night when I was put in jail, I give you thanks. For the thirst and the shackles, the nakedness and hunger, I give you thanks. For the proof of salt on unworthy lips, I give you thanks. For the moment of generosity when your example took me to form for the blue phalanx, since you, my captain and my friend, led me to the march along with the dedicated without you merits of my part, and you are giving me to the sweets of merit for the signs of faith. Let me lead your vanguard. I give you thanks. Let me finish with the invocation to our Mother Mary. She is a woman whom any woman in this world can say is able to eliminate, said Pope Francis. We two men, we are her children, find in her tenderness and affection. Mary was a normal girl like any other girl. She was not a girl from a big town, but she did live in a small town. This is what she writes. Let us ask her intercede for us, and let us turn to her with these words. Mary, Virgin and Mother, you who moved by the Holy Spirit, welcome the word of life in the depth of our humble faith. As you gave yourself completely to the Eternal One, help us to say our own yes to the urgent call, as pressing as ever, to proclaim the good news of Jesus. Obtain for us new ardor born to the resurrection, so that we may bring to all the gospel of life which triumphs over death. Give us a holy courage to seek new paths, that the gift of unfading beauty may reach every man and woman.